Strippin, Magellan played for the football team and majored in art studies. On Monday, December 8, 1941, halfway through his senior year and second year as a cadet in the college's ROTC program, Jim Magellan tuned in his radio and listened as President Franklin Roosevelt talked about a date which will live in infamy. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, a day earlier.
We knew that the war clouds were gathering, and those of us in ROTC, we were seniors. We were going to graduate shortly, and expecting we'd go on active duty. And all of a sudden we realized we were at war.
In May of 1942, 25-year-old James Magellan, diploma in hand, World War II raging, wanted in the fight, badly.
When I walked across the stage at Ripon College with my cap and gown on, in one hand I had a Bachelor of Arts degree, and the other one I had a commission as second lieutenant.
But fresh out of college, Second Lieutenant Magellan landed in the Signal Corps, soldiers responsible for military communications, a support role, and hardly the front line on the battlefield. Magellan wanted out, and his ticket was a private pilot's license acquired before the war. The Army was looking for glider pilots, so this son of Wisconsin shipped out of the Signal Corps and trained in the heat and dust of Texas in gliders. At that very same time, American troops were landing in North Africa in November of 1942 as part of Operation Torch.
My only question was, what is the quickest way that I can get into combat?
Jim Magellan was now a glider man, until Uncle Sam discovered they had too many of those. So in the late spring of 1943, Magellan, still itching for a fight, arrived at the parachute training school at Fort Benning, Georgia, to give something called the Airborne Paratroops a go. If he couldn't fly into the fight in Europe, he would jump in.
I knew that it was risky. I knew it required a special kind of guy that was willing to do that. But I was one of those kinds of guys.
Magellan's training in the States as a parachutist continued as the 82nd Airborne jumped into Sicily in July of '43 as part of Operation Husky. The Airborne gave Jim Magellan what he wanted most: the quickest route to war.
That was the truth. I was in combat in short order.
Jim Magellan left for the war in Europe from Newport News, Virginia, on September 5, 1943, aboard a 10,000-ton Liberty ship, which had been converted into a troop carrier. On the same boat was his best friend, another 82nd Airborne second lieutenant named Richard LaRiviere from Chicopee, Massachusetts. Maggie and Rivers became buddies at Benning and would serve side by side in some of the war's most fierce battles. Both men would prove to be exceptional platoon leaders.
We were both thrust into the same situation. We both went through parachute school together, got to know each other, and were assigned to the same company.
They were like brothers. Jim is more refined, very detailed in his speech, and very well-mannered. My father, very direct.
They liked one another. They wanted the best out of everybody, and they gave their best too. So you didn't hesitate to do what they told you to do. Both were afraid they wouldn't get to the war before to kill German soldiers. That's what they said too, and they did everything to make this come true. And they didn't know what we had left, but we had enough time left to give them everything they wanted.
On September 13th, while en route to North Africa, Jim Magellan learned the 82nd Airborne had jumped into Salerno, Italy. Magellan, Rivers, and the other newest paratroopers of the 82nd docked in Oran, French Morocco, 12 days later. More training would ensue in North Africa, until word came in late November that Magellan and Rivers were to join H Company, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 3rd Battalion of the 82nd Airborne, as replacements for those killed or wounded in Sicily and Italy. 25-year-old Lieutenant Jim Magellan and his good buddy Richard LaRiviere reported for duty in the middle of a brutal fight in the rugged Apennine Mountains of Italy, near Monte Cassino in late 1943.
I was where I wanted to be, on the cutting edge of the battlefield.
Fighting in those damn mountains is a very difficult thing to do. Twice as difficult to do your fighting in a mountainous area that is where you have to move bricks and move stones and move everything else in order to get past, to get a unit past anyway.
The one thing more prominent than other was, not that I would get killed. I was in combat. I had already come to terms with that. I want you to know that. I came to terms with that when I went to paratroopers, that I could die. But what I thought about more than anything was that I would get maimed and become an amputee or something and be shipped home, and the sorrow and the grief I would cause my family.
The fighting in Italy was static, the mountains favoring the defender, in this case, the Germans. The Apennines would be a proving ground for Lieutenants Magellus and Rivers, who both soon realized they weren't going to stay alive long if they fought this war by the Army manual.
We didn't go by the book at all. We went by what was right. Now, Rivers and I were older. We were more mature. We'd seen combat.
I'm surprised that the two different people, Magellus and Rivers, they're different as hell, were so damn good at what they did.
They were very well respected, and the guys would do anything for them.
You can tell after so many days of combat whether someone's going to last very long.
The fighting is done in squads and platoons by privates, many teenage kids, led by non-commissioned officers and junior officers.
His first combat action was terrific of what he did. I mean, he held on to the territory. The Germans were trying to take it away from us, and they didn't get in there.
Much of what Jim Magellus learned in the mountains of Italy also came from watching the Germans, how they would fire and maneuver. He soaked in every lesson of each fight, filing the information away for future battles.
I could just tell that he was he was an intelligent individual. He was a college graduate, which you don't get too much in the officers at that time.
The Gustav line ran across the peninsula and was anchored at Cassino. To break the stalemate, we tried an end run, amphibious landings at Anzio and Nettuno.
The fighting in the mountains of Italy was Jim Magellus's baptism of fire, but it would be the brutal carnage at Anzio, on the Italian coast just south of Rome, beginning in late January of 1944, that would change Second Lieutenant Magellus dramatically. It was here he was wounded twice and left behind the young man who was James Magellus of 3rd Street and South Park Avenue in quiet Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. In Anzio, Magellus transformed into Maggie, known simply as a fearless leader, weapon always in hand and with a single focus.
The turning point in my career as a combat soldier, when Maggie became Maggie, was at the Battle of Anzio. That was brutal. I was wounded twice. We were surrounded by the enemy, or as I like to put it, we had them surrounded from the inside. We were about out of ammunition. I had a limp arm. We didn't have any food. We didn't have anything. We had no contact of any kind with anybody. And that fighting was so bitter, and people that we lost and bodies that I dragged back, that it changed my whole attitude. It was no longer I was in combat and I had to survive. We were up against a bitter enemy, and it was us against them. My MOS, military occupational specialty, and that of the men who fought with me was, simply stated, killing Germans. Nothing more, nothing less. And I did that an awful lot.
It was in Anzio that 1st Platoon leader Maggie Magellus learned one lesson he would take with him through the rest of World War II in Europe. Leaders must always lead from the front.
If I was the best guy to be out in front and to lead rather than stand back in command, that's the way it had to be, as I was the leader. I wouldn't send an 18-year-old kid to go out and try and disarm mines when I knew better. I'd do it.
His leadership instilled kind of a confidence in you that you were going to get this done. I liked the guy.
Leadership develops in the field of battle, people who respond to a situation. And it was because you were born that way or anything else. I've never said that.
In April of 1944, after 62 days of fighting on the brutal Anzio beachhead, the 504th, now nicknamed the Devils in Baggy Pants by the battered Germans, was sent back to England to regroup. Anzio had cost the Allies almost 30,000 casualties, and the 504th had been hit especially hard. For his leadership actions in Italy, Jim Magellan was awarded a Bronze Star, Buddy Richard La Riviere a Silver Star, and the entire regiment a Presidential Unit Citation. Because of the carnage at Anzio, the 504th would sit out the June 6 D-Day jump, disappointing Maggie, Rivers, and many others. The newly created 507th and 508th would go to Normandy instead. England would be a place for more training, as Lieutenant Magellan and the rest of the 504th readied for Operation Market Garden, the invasion of Holland. As a paratrooper, it would be Maggie's first official combat jump from a C-47. H Company's drop zone on September 17th were large open fields near the Dutch city of Grave. Their ultimate objective would be the capture of the rail and highway bridges in Nijmegen, assisting the British in their dash for the city of Arnhem and a route across the Rhine River into Germany. 7 decades later, now retired Lieutenant Colonel James Magellan is on a much more comfortable plane headed back to Europe with a small group of family, friends, and 82nd Airborne veterans he served with in the war. His old C-47 prop plane replaced by an American Airlines 767 jet. This time, Maggie won't need a parachute, and no one will be shooting at him as he arrives. His mission will also be very different. It is here in Holland, back in the Dutch countryside, where Jim Magellan's thoughts become more focused. He visualizes the events of September 1944. Snapshots of planes, parachutes, and men crossing a turbulent river come into focus. He is Maggie again, back in the middle of World War II.
We knew we were part of a larger cause, greater than ourselves, but that wasn't what motivated us. What motivated us was to get the enemy. They were our enemy. They were out to kill us. And that's what war is all about.
He was without fear, and so it gave you a shot in the arm.
Revisiting the battlefields of Europe provides a time for reflection. Many long-forgotten memories are revived as the landscape rolls by. Images of his C-47 approaching the drop zone in Holland become vivid. The sights, the sounds, the jolt of his parachute opening, the Germans watching him from below.
I could see all these bullets coming at me. Everyone looked like, because of the deflection of angle, like it was going to hit me right here in the forehead.
As was always the case with Maggie, the first order of business was the welfare of his men.
My concern, get on the ground, get ready to defend myself, make sure my men were accounted for, and we assembled, and we got into the assemble area, and I could count them, and I could talk to my squad leaders and take noses and see what we lost. We lost 2 men out of my platoon over the drop zone. Okay, guys, hold up here, and they all say, if you got them, smoke them, light up.
Today, horses graze on the original drop zone outside of Grave, much like their ancestors did in 1944. The only new features on these fields are parachute-like memorials, marking the spot where the 82nd came on a quiet Sunday afternoon in September of 1944 to liberate Holland. While other 504th men went on to different objectives, Lieutenant Maggie Magellan and H Company moved toward the bridges at Nijmegen, where in 3 days they would be assigned one of the most difficult missions in all of World War II, the crossing of 400 yards of brown, churning water known as the Wall River. After that, they would have to capture the vitally important rail and highway bridges in Nijmegen, which were crucial to the success of Operation Market Garden.
Here I was, young guy, just out of college, volunteered for paratroopers fighting in a brutal war and the scene of a bloody battle. And that's the effect it has on me. Other than that, to be here and have any emotional feeling about it or anything, yeah, it's a tragedy, and I relive it, but it doesn't have an effect on me that way.
H&I companies of the 3rd Battalion of the 504th got the word that on September 20th, they would have to cross the wall from the southern side, leaving from near an old power station, which remains part of the landscape today. H&I would attack the Germans on the north side and then seize both the railroad and highway bridges in Nijmegen, so British tanks could get across and make a dash for Arnhem. It would be 250 men of the 504th against more than 1,000 Germans, including elite SS troops who were on the north side of the river and on the 2 bridges, all in perfect position to rain down fire on the Americans crossing the river in broad daylight.
We knew we weren't surprising anybody. That we knew. And so when guys got together in groups, they felt, well, this is it, guys, you know. And I told my buddy Rivers, look, I said, Rivers, if you make it across and I don't, go to Wisconsin and see my mother and tell her what happened. He said, Maggie, I'll do the same if you do that for me as well. Go to Massachusetts, Chicopee Falls. I said, okay, it's a deal. And when they opened up the cover of this sort of box truck where they had brought the boats up in, they got up and they peeled them off like a deck of cards. Here's your boat.
The 504th would have to make the crossing in small canvas and wood-bottom boats, hastily delivered by the British, most of which didn't have paddles. 33 were needed, only 26 arrived. The mission was already off to a bad start.
We were behind this dike, and we charged over the top, carrying these flimsy canvas boats, and charged down this embankment and set our boats in the water.
We lost our mind. You can't get across in that heavy fire in those little boats. But you do it anyway.
But I can tell you honestly and sincerely that I didn't think any of us would make it across that river to the opposite dike where the Germans were dug in with machine guns. We might have got across the river, but whether we could navigate that open terrain and rout the Germans and capture the bridges, I didn't think any of us would make it.
At 1500 hours on September 20th, 1944, 504th Major Julian Cook blew his whistle, and the first wave of paratroopers from H&I companies grabbed their flimsy boats and headed for the south bank of the Wall River.
The Wall River, to me, stands out because of its daring and courage. The Germans couldn't believe that we would do it. Paratroopers did an awful lot of things. We went up mountains and we made assault landings and we attacked cities and we did everything. But asked to do that, which appeared to be an impossible mission, made that something that you'd never forget.
The people were taking their rifles and rowing, trying to get across quicker, because that was withering fire. And they put up smoke, but wind blew it right away. So we were pretty easy targets for the Germans at that time.
Some of them guys didn't have no paddles even, and that took a long time under all that fire.
I used my hands. Besides, I could duck down a little further in the boat with my hands.
The casualties we had and the brutality of it in a period of, say, 4 hours was unequaled in any battles that we fought.
You just had to keep going and going.
I don't know how anybody lived through that.
And our chaplain was praying, and our battalion commander was citing the rosary. And we were praying under heavy fire and looking to the Lord for guidance and for his assistance.
I kept seeing all them faces. I still do. Of all them guys, like the kid who killed sitting next to me in the boat trying to get across that river.
I got out of the boat and got on land, and we were fishing, and my friend said to me, "You peed your pants." I said, "No, I didn't." I said, "There's a hole right there in that canteen. That's how I got wet." And it's just an incident that, you know, I've got a canteen with a bullet hole in it at home in the garage. And it just as a reminder, you know, that how close I came.
Getting across the wall in slow canvas boats, with enemy fire directly on top of them, was bad enough. What awaited platoon leader Magellan, Rivers, and the men of the 504th on the other side of the river wasn't a walk in the park either.
If there ever was hell on earth, that was it. And we were it. And once you got there, then it was, no, you guys are going to pay for it.
On the north bank of the wall were more Germans, dug in along a road dike with an open field of fire on the men of the 82nd as they emptied out of their boats.
And the Germans were determined here to stop us.
If he got down, ran for cover, you got down, ran for cover. And if he advanced, you went with him.
What drove us up here was rage and vengeance. And we were cussing and swearing. And we had no place to take cover.
When we got over to the riverbank and threw hand grenades across over to the Germans on the other side, they picked them up and threw them back.
More out of futility than anything else, we were firing like the Thompson submachine gun, firing in this direction.
No place to hide. No place to hide from the machine gun fire that was coming.
The only thing is we had to get here. And so we charged up into it, and we had a number of men that were killed that made it across the river but didn't make it across this open area.
After eliminating the Germans on the dike, H&I companies were still taking heavy fire from Fort Hof van Holland on the north side of the wall. Magellan and his men had to take out the Germans firing from the fort before there were any thoughts of H Company heading for their first objective, the railroad bridge.
The entrance was around behind, which we didn't know. There was a moat and a drawbridge and a moat around the water. And the Germans were in there and they had these weapons that they were firing from outside this fort.
One of his sergeants stripped down a little bit and swam across the moat. Then from there they had a little firefight with whoever was trying to defend the fort.
Today, the residents of Hof van Holland aren't Germans, but Dutch professors at a local university at Nijmegen. Maggie's reception inside the fort today is quite different than it was on September 20th, 1944.
We knew where the enemy was. We could see the objectives. We knew who was firing at us. So let's go get them, guys. We didn't need any further orders. Our commanders were on the other side of the river anyway.
For the men of H&I companies, securing the railroad bridge over the wall became personal, payback for the German slaughter of 82nd men crossing the river. When the rail bridge was finally secured, 267 Germans were dead. Not many prisoners were taken.
There's nothing greater than rage and the desire for revenge.
Less than a mile away, other men from H&I companies of the 504th secured the north end of the 1,800-foot-long highway bridge over the wall. Many more Germans were killed. American casualties were 40 men killed and 100 wounded in just over 4 hours of battle. After all the carnage, British tanks finally crossed the bridge at Nijmegen, but were inexplicably ordered to stop and not move onto Arnhem. Market Garden would ultimately fail. The 504th would be awarded another Presidential Unit citation for its courage at the Wall River and for taking the bridges. Visiting Nijmegen today doesn't lessen the pain for platoon leader Maggie Magellan. However, it does put the fight in perspective.
And it was a war of survival. And we were up against an enemy that had already ravaged all of Europe It had enslaved a good part of the world. And I look back and how I viewed it in combat and how I viewed killing my enemy, it makes a little sense in that context. Today, I wouldn't advocate that.
If Jim Magellan is looking for any signs that the crossing of the Wall River was indeed worth the price, then just down the road from the Nijmegen bridges, that can be found.
Hello. Welcome at our school.
I'm Colonel Magellan.
A school named De Oversteek, or translated, The Crossing, was built some years ago in honor of the heroics of the 504th on September 20th, 1944. It's a place Maggie has visited a few times on his trips back to Holland, speaking to the great-grandchildren of those he helped to liberate.
I come here because this is the Oversteek, and for what you do to keep the memory of the Wall River crossing alive. When you come here and you see people that are grateful like the Dutch are,
Thank you very much.
then you realize that our efforts and what we were doing and the sacrifice we made were worthwhile, because here are future generations that now live in peace, can go to school of their choice, have freedom to move, they have freedom to go on to school, they have all the freedoms that they didn't have when we got here.
Even though Market Garden itself was a failure, Lieutenant Jim Magellan and the soldiers of the 504th weren't done fighting in Holland.
This is the area where we took up defensive positions after the mission failed at Arnhem. The 82nd Airborne Division was deployed along a line here because this is the boundary between Holland and Germany. And we could look out here, and this is where the Germans were at.
On September 30th, word came of an impending German attack in the area of the Weiler Mere, a long, narrow body of water on the border of Holland and Germany. The regiment needed prisoners who could talk about the upcoming offensive, and Maggie Magellan was once again called on to lead a dangerous patrol to find some.
Well, I took my whole platoon. The medic, I took everybody. We expected to get in a heavy firefight, and casualties and all the rest, and so we started out. At that time in 1944, when I led this patrol, I was 27 years old. I was an old man. And most of the men in my patrol were teenagers or young guys, 20 or 21. You're responsible for their well-being, and you've got a mission to accomplish. You're going to use the best guy that you've got to lead that patrol, and that happened to be me. If we were running into an enemy situation, I knew what to expect. If I'm running into a minefield, I knew how to disarm a mine. I knew how to do all these things. Whereas a lot of my guys were great soldiers, but they didn't have that same skill. So I always used the term that I was a platoon leader and I led from the front. I wasn't a commander who commands from the rear. I could see out ahead of me maybe 20, maybe 40 feet ahead, a couple of German helmets popped up out of a hole. I said, here's where they are. So I took one of my hand grenades, pulled the pin, and I rolled it in on them. And then I crawled over to the next hole and repeated it. I says, kommen Sie mit der Hand. Nothing. So I rolled in another one. I go over to another hole and I holler again, come out, and he didn't do it. And this time, instead of a hand grenade, I went on the edge of that foxhole with my Thompson submachine gun, opened fire on him. We kind of fanned out into 3 squads, and then we charged over the top and got in behind there where the Germans dug in. And we got in a firefight.
The result of H Company's prisoner grab was 17 dead Germans and 6 prisoners, and only 1 man wounded, Sergeant Jack Fowler.
The most dreaded words that a combat platoon leader can hear in a situation like that is a call for medic, because you know somebody's been hit.
Magellan carried the wounded Fowler back to company lines.
So I picked him up and I threw him over my shoulder like a fireman carry. And then I gave the call, let's pull back. and one of them had 2 more prisoners. And I hollered to him, "Bring those guys over here to me." And I said to him in German, "Mach schnell, get going, hurry, let's get going." As we started out, began to pull away back, the Germans began to then shoot up flares. So we'd hit the dirt, but we finally made it back. And when I got to this Weiler Mere and that footbridge, I knew we were home safe. I never thought about it. It was a day's work. Later on, I was told that I was being put in for a medal. You're not out trying to earn any distinction for yourself. It's you or the enemy. He kills you or you kill him.
For his leadership of the patrol along the Weiler Mere, Lieutenant Jim Magellan was later awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, next to the Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest award given to an American soldier in combat. On November 13, 1944, after 57 days in combat, H Company and the 504th were taken off the line in Holland and returned to France for rest and retraining. He didn't know it then, but in just over a month, Maggie would find himself in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge. The Margraten Cemetery in Holland is the final resting place for many of the 82nd men Jim Magellan and his fellow 504th veterans fought alongside in Holland, from the Wall River to the Weiler Mere. The wall crossing felt like a suicide mission to all those who stepped into those canvas boats. But for one friend of Maggie's in particular, the premonition of impending death came true. Decades later, Jim Magellan visits the White Cross of Lieutenant Harold Busby.
And while Rivers and I were congregated and saying, you know, if we make it, go and see our mothers, and Pappy Bus, this is the final resting place.
The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last gamble at victory in World War II. On December 17th, Maggie, H Company, and the 504th got the word they were headed from France to the Ardennes forest in Belgium. Their first major test would come in the small town of Chenot against elite troops from the 1st SS Panzer Division.
This was one of our objectives, and the Germans were coming from that direction. We're coming around the other side, and we're coming over this rolling territory near the Somme River, and then we start down a knoll, a grassy knoll, and the Germans were in there, and they had all of their units and their mechanized units, and the whole thing had arrived here. And when we started down this knoll, they opened fire on us. And with 20-millimeter flak wagons again, and guys were dropping all around.
For Magellan was not winning more medals, but always the well-being of his men.
I took personal interest in every one of my guys, and the tragedy of it was, a lot of these guys I never really got to know. And you believe this, that in over 2 years, and I commanded, I was with H Company, we turned over the personnel in that company 10 times. 10 times. We dug our foxholes. I spread out my platoon over a certain area, set my machine gun in a certain place. And then I'd go and I'd check with each guy. And I'd have 2 guys in the hole. I always make sure one was awake. Are you guys okay? How's your ammunition? Your gun's working? You feeling all right? Do you need anything? Then at night, when it's dark, and it's quiet and it's eerie, and the enemy running patrols, you always have to be alert. Every sound, there was something back of it. Somebody was stirring around. It was the enemy. They'd penetrate your lines, which they did. So you had to be alert all the time. If you hadn't got it prepared, forget it. You got to look out for your men. And the commander that doesn't look out for his men isn't going to succeed. because commander can do nothing on his own.
There were lighter moments in combat for Maggie and the men. One came with his buddy Rivers, after clearing Germans out of a century-old church in the Belgian town of Grand Hollow. Magellus's days as an altar boy in Wisconsin paid off.
So I crawl around back in there, and I find 4 bottles of wine. I grabbed them. Those were the fruits of victory, so to speak, or spoils of the war, or whatever. So I take these bottles, and Rivers, he's Catholic. I'm Greek Orthodox. He's Catholic. He was a little upset about stealing wine from the church. So I take a couple bottles of wine, and we go over there. Well, who happens to be there that night but Chaplain Kozak, Catholic priest? And Rivers part of his flock. And get back in there, and I break out this wine. I'll pour it around. And Kozak tasted. And he looked at me and looked at Rivers. He said, "Where'd you get this?" He says, "Maggie got it." He said, "This altar wine." Well, I said, so what? They don't need it anymore. He got all upset. He gave Rivers hell. He says, when that priest comes back, he's not going to be able to give communion. Oh, Maggie, careless, they ever had communion here or not.
Many decades later, a quick check behind that very same altar by Magellus confirms the sacramental wine has a new hiding place.
Well, it's changed some. Back in that corner was the wine.
Over the course of his time as leader of H Company, Jim Magellus had proven himself one of the 82nd's best officers. He commanded from the front with total disregard for his own life. He was fearless, but also cared deeply about the men he led. He was also, at times, reflective and introspective of the violent world he was now a part of.
I'd be alone in a foxhole, and I'd look up at night and I'd see the stars. And I found solace in the stars. And I think back to the days of the mariners and others who were guided by stars. And I got to know Orion the Hunter, and I got to know the North Star. And all these things had meaning for me.
In no other situation would all of Lieutenant Maggie Magellus's experiences and lessons learned in battle come into play than on January 28, 1945, in Harrisbach, Belgium. The Germans held Harrisbach, a small village nestled in the Ardennes forest, and a place where the view hasn't changed much since January of 1945. Militarily, Harrisbach stood between the Americans and the Siegfried Line, so it had to be taken. After 12 hours of walking through deep snowdrifts to reach the outskirts of the town, Maggie, Rivers, and their platoons ran directly into more than 300 Germans heading in their direction, supported by a Panther Mark V tank.
Well, you have to realize that this area was covered with heavy snow, maybe 2 feet of snow.
When we went into Harrisbach, we went head on into this German battalion, just by complete surprise. And everybody starts shooting.
And the minute we opened fire, it was pandemonium. I mean, everybody was shooting. Our guys were all firing.
I had a Thompson by that time, and I was just pointing and shooting. They're following right and left, here and there. I don't know how many I hit. I put rounds in the direction, and there's just Germans falling all over the place. And they were the most confused German bunch I ever saw.
And after about 10 or 15 minutes firing, it quieted down. We killed a lot of them ran in the woods and escaped and so on. Actually, the ground was littered with blood and dead, and it was all Germans. Wasn't an American hit. None of us were hit at all. It was the most amazing thing.
We caught them completely by surprise, and the difference was we reacted before they reacted.
We proceeded to come up this road, and when we got near here, a tank came or must have come around this road and set up and began to fire at us.
The tank was out there. That was the main weapon they had.
And I was in the lead element of my platoon, and we were coming down the road, and the minute they fired on us, we took cover.
Magellus, seeing the fact that there was a lot of trees along this road, he went along the road between tree to tree while it was firing at him and his platoon.
I ran off the side of the road and got in that wooded area, so I had concealment heading for the tank. And I proceeded over there and got there close enough so that I could take what I call a gammon grenade out of my pocket.
Maggie made 2 gammon grenades every time he was going to go out on an attack, and carried them in his pocket.
The gammon grenade was a composition C plastic, a plastic explosive that you could mold. And I had it molded into a ball, and I had a cover over it with a firing device.
It just so happened that he was a lieutenant who was ready for anything when he in there.
I got in close enough to the tank, and they didn't see me. And I threw it over in the broadside of the tank, and it hit the side of it.
It probably killed everybody in the tank, because it's a concussion grenade.
The gunner who was up there went down into the tank. There was a turret there, and the machine gun, he went down into the tank. And I then charged up the tank and came up and got up there close enough.
Although he didn't have to, he ran up and got on top of the tank and dropped a grenade in there.
I don't know how many were in the tank, but it could have been a crew of 5. I didn't bother to look, I wasn't concerned. But I threw a hand grenade in there, and then things were all quiet. So I get up and I motion, let's go.
After that tank incident, and then we got into town, we were knocking them out of buildings. And they're lining them up. Over 100 some, you know. And it wouldn't, we wouldn't have done that without any casualties if he hadn't taken that tank out. That's my feeling.
We didn't lose anybody in that whole damn operation.
Over 100 Germans were dead, 180 captured. Incredibly, in all that firing, there was not one American casualty. For his leadership at Harrisburg, Lieutenant Jim Magellan received another Silver Star. Many who were there obviously felt he deserved much more.
Nobody else saw what I saw that morning, what he did. There were no officers up there to see what Maggie did. And none of them came up after it was done.
Now, if you jump on and you knock out a tank by yourself with hand grenade, a gammon grenade, then jump on top of it while people are shooting around and drop a grenade in the turret, that's just a little bit beyond the ordinary. And that's what you call extraordinary heroism, above and beyond. That's what I feel.
And what do? You say, well, hey, Sergeant, you take your squad and get over there and just baloney. I took off right away. There was that tank. I knew how to disable it. I had the wherewithal. I had grenades in my pocket. I had some grenades. I didn't hesitate. I went. That was the heat of battle. That had to be done. And I was the platoon leader. Who else is going to do it?
You know, I studied what you needed for Medal of Honors, and I thought, well, Jesus, this is far beyond what you would expect some human being to do.
When Sims and Gray put him in for a Medal of Honor, they wrote the thing all up and sent it up.
We got a new company commander in, and I made a recommendation to him that Magellan should be put in for a Medal of Honor.
It got the battalion, the regiment, and I think, I hate to criticize any, but I think the adjutant took the easy way out, and he sanitized it and sent it up for a Silver Star, and he left out completely the fact that there was a tank involved.
No mention was made of the tank in what they put out, and that's what Magellan was awarded, the Silver Star, for that action.
If they knocked it down to a DSC, it wouldn't have been as bad. But to kick it down to the Silver Star, come on, you know. That Silver Star was kind of an officer's good conduct medal, you know what I mean?
They told him at battalion headquarters that there would be no Medal of Honor because there were no casualties. He had no casualties. I said, what has that got to do with it, for God's sake? And the fact that he had no casualties is another reason why he should be put in for it.
The German army was being pushed back across the Rhine into Germany.
And they assembled him over here, and Chaplain Wood, he was the senior chaplain, division chaplain. He had a message for him. They were responsible for it. Sort of Are the government responsible for you, or you are responsible for your government? That sort of thing. And by your own indifference and acceptance of all this is what you've sown.
Six days after liberating Ludwigslust, the war in Europe ended as Germany formally surrendered. Lieutenant Maggie Magellas and H Company of the 504th moved on to Berlin. There they saw an entire city devastated, from the Reichstag Parliament building to the smallest of neighborhoods.
I asked one German, who spoke English, and I asked him why, when you knew you were done, did you keep fighting so furiously? He said, we're like a family. He said, for 4 years, 4.5 years, 5, nobody but the rest of the squad, that was our family then. And that's why they did that. It made sense to me.
On points alone, Lieutenant Jim Magellas could have gone home instead of pulling occupation duty in the German capital. But Maggie, the soldier, first needed some closure to his war.
That I was going to go on to Berlin because Hitler had told the German people that when Americans enter the war, we won't worry about them because they're soft. They can't fight. And I said, I'm going to go to Berlin. I'm going to teach them Germans something different. And I went there, and I really wasn't happy about them at all. Because after all, they were goose-stepping. They were in all the youth organizations. They were cheering and hooting and hailing Hitler all over the place when they were riding high. We left dead all over the battlefield. I had no feeling for them. And that's a terrible thing to say, because I do now. I respect the German people. But then I didn't.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
I was there.
Decades later, James Magellas revisits a beautiful and completely rebuilt Berlin, where the Brandenburg Gate still stands tall and the Reichstag building has been rebuilt. Today, German citizens greet Jim Magellas as a hero, not a conquering enemy. This is the world he now lives in. He's no longer Maggie. Maggie belonged to World War II.
How you can take peaceful, loving young guys out of school and trust them in a situation like this and make a transition. They had to become killers to survive and prevail. And then, once the war ends 2.5 years later, to come back and become a useful citizen and take up your place in society again and pick up where you left off. It just happens to you in combat. You become this from peaceful, loving guy and all this, all of a sudden you're a killer. You're in for the duration of the war, and you're seeking revenge for your buddies you lost.
On January 12, 1946, Lieutenant Maggie Magellas and the rest of the famed 82nd Airborne Division were officially welcomed home with a victory parade down Fifth Avenue in New York City. Maggie led H Company's march. The following morning, Jim Magellas boarded a train west and headed home for Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, which is a long way from Anzio, the Wall, the Weiler Mere, Harrisbach, and Berlin. Maggie's war was over.
And I just wanted to make sure, when I talked to school kids, that they fully understood what was involved and how we, like those kids in school, just out of school, were thrust in this kind of a situation.
Jim Magellas some of the men Maggie led in many of World War II's bloodiest battles gather once again in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, Jim Magellas' hometown, where the local Veterans Center bears his name. They reunite for most likely the last time. These once young soldiers are in their late 80s now, and in Jim Magellas' case, his mid-90s.
All the way to Berlin.
They come to share stories and share laughs, not so much to talk about the fight itself, but to keep hold of the bond they all still share. unspoken but still very much alive, born out of adversity from a war fought a long time ago. They also come to honor and say thank you to a highly decorated platoon leader whom they still respect, a man who always led from the front and who cared deeply for all his men. Many are still alive because of his exceptional leadership in battle.
Them kind of guys have something extra, and it comes out. They're leaders.
He had a strong feeling about his men. He had a strong feeling about himself, which made him a good leader. The good luck, the fortunate, intelligent, and persistent and consistent. You know, he could count on his men, and he did.
He knew what the hell he was doing. You know, you could tell he knew his stuff. He wasn't the normal young lieutenant that I'd been dealing with in my Army career up to that time. And Rivers was real competent, too.
I've looked at my own life over the years, and my personal opinion is good leaders are born.
What makes a brave man is when he's got a group of people, as far as I'm concerned, and how big they are, it doesn't make any difference. He's there when they are going through the worst part of any type of fighting.
Sealed from the river and from the enemy on the other side, guys gathered in little groups. They're best friends, 3, 4 together, 4 or 5, and discussed it. And I quote some of them as saying, "This is a suicide mission. We're not going to make it." Others had different feelings. They came and talked to me and said, "This is the day I'm going to get it. I have a strong feeling." That a premonition. And everybody viewed it that way. But the interesting thing about it is that we were given orders to cross this river. And we happened to be in the 2 companies in the lead battalion. We weren't bemoaning our luck to say, "Well, why is it us? Why didn't the British doing it? Look at all the soldiers they got. Why didn't somebody else do it?" That wasn't it at all. Our number was called. That was it. You do it. And whether or not someone else should be doing it, that was not within our purview. We had to do it. And we knew it was a difficult mission. And I can tell you this, that when we stood behind this dike in a concealed position waiting for the boats to arrive, the British Lancaster bombers flew overhead and came over and bombed this whole area, dropped bombs, in advance of our crossing the river to soften them up. And when we saw those bombers come over and the flak that the Germans shot up from the other side, the sky was black. And I write in my book, you could have walked on the flak, it was so thick. And they were shooting up at these planes. And down below this dike, in an open area, a G Company sent a patrol led by a Lieutenant Wisniewski, another good close friend of mine. And their job was to clear this approach to the river for us so that we could, when we climbed over the top of their boats, we could get into the water. They got fired at from across the river, and he was killed, and several others were killed. The patrol failed, it was pinned down, and he laid there, and he was mortally wounded. He didn't die right away, but he was mortally wounded. And we knew all that. We'd seen that. We then realized that the opposition was pretty heavy, and we began to speculate. Well, how many guys are over there? We didn't know, but we knew it was a sizable number. We knew we weren't surprising anybody. That we knew. And so when guys got together in groups, they felt, well, this is it, guys. You know. And I told my buddy Rivers, look, I said, Rivers, if you make it across and I don't, go to Wisconsin and see my mother and tell her what happened. He said, Maggie, I'll do the same if you do that for me as well. Go to Massachusetts, Chicopee Falls. I said, okay, it's a deal. And other guys were talking about in their own way. And others were, as I mentioned earlier, were giving away valuables, watches and things of any value, and saying, we don't need this where we're going. And I relate that, as I relate the way I felt. I tell the audience, I look at them right in the eye, and I said, I can tell you honestly and sincerely that I didn't think any of us would make it across that river to the opposite dike where the Germans were dug in with machine guns. We might have got across the river, but whether we could navigate that open terrain and rout the Germans and capture the bridges, I didn't think any of us would make it. That was an honest feeling. But in spite of it, you had the feeling it was our mission, and we were going to do it. Or, like you say, we'd die, or like we would die in the attempt. And that's what we felt at the time, that it was an impossible mission, but the urgency of the situation, as we understood it, was such that it had to be done, and it had to be done quickly, if the mission itself was going to succeed and we reach our objective. So it was a lot riding on it. It was an important thing, and because we were the guys that had to do it. We were the guys that had to do it. That was just unfortunate, but that's the way it was. When we were told the night before we were going to cross this river, and we knew it was a wide river and a swift current, we knew that, we figured we'd have some propulsion. Oh, in a general way, we were familiar with some of the boats are being used in the Pacific and island hopping and attacking islands. We were generally familiar with it. We thought we'd be something like a Higgins boat. We'd turn on the motor, we'd get across in a hurry, and we'd be over there, we'd gauge the enemy, and it'd be bloody, but, you know, we'd do it. And then they began to speculate. And the guy said, well, we don't know what kind of boats they are. We don't know how many they got. Nobody really knew. And the thing about it was, the 30th Armored Corps was not amphibious either. They didn't have any amphibious boats. What they had were collapsible canvas boats that you pull the staves out and they laid flat like a pancake, and they loaded them onto their trucks. And when they opened up the cover of this sort of box truck where they had brought the boats up in, they got up and they peeled them off like a deck of cards. Here's your boat. And we were down below grabbing them and carting them off and pulling them up and putting staves in there. It was 18 inches from the gunwales to the bottom. There were no place for oars. There were no oars. No means of propulsion. No means of steering except in the back. There was a little rudder kind of thing like that you might find like down in the bayous where they navigate around trees. That was the only means of propulsion. We had no other means to cross this swift river. So when we saw that, we were surprised because we didn't know what to expect. And I always said this, that in the absence of actual hard information, and troops have a mission to do, then rumors take over. And guys were speculating whatever they felt like. Oh, don't worry, it'd be okay, or, you know, I don't know how we're going to do it. And everybody had some kind of a story. I didn't have any story. I waited in anticipation. Let's see what these boats looks like. But when they came there and we saw it, then we knew that we were in for a pretty tough job. And that's when we realized that it wasn't going to be humanly possible for us to cross in what they had just given us. And that's how we felt about it when we first saw them. Those of us that got across jumped out of the boat and headed for the dike, because this is where the enemy were entrenched, and we had to overcome this position in order for us to get to the bridges. And the Germans were determined here to stop us. And so this area that we're looking at between here and the bridges and where we crossed this river is an expanse of flat ground from 500 yards, 800 yards, and I'll repeat again that 100 yards is the length of a football field. And people can visualize a football field. Well, now visualize 5 football fields right after the other. And we're charging out. And we're running on adrenaline. That's the point. We were just through a harrowing experience of being shot at as ducks and seeing men killed and boats floating down the river and guys falling in the river. And we just experienced that. And it was an emotional experience. So when we got out, we were driven by rage. Believe me now, I want to make this point clear. What drove us up here was rage and vengeance. And we were cussing and swearing. And we had no place to take cover. And the machine guns were firing away at us and so on. And we just charged. And what we did, more out of futility than anything else, we were firing like the tops of submachine gun, firing in this direction while we were charging forward. What else could we do? We had no way. But we couldn't get behind cover or anything. The only thing is we had to get here. And so we charged up into it, and we had a number of men that were killed that made it across the river but didn't make it across this open area. And the plan was this, and this is where one of the themes that I want to stress comes into play. The plan was that if we made it to this dike, where we knew the Germans were entrenched, that we would assemble I Company on the left and H Company on the right. We'd go over there and get our units together, what we had of them, and then we would proceed towards our objectives. H Company would go to the main bridge, and I Company would go to the other bridge. It was a preconceived plan that if we'd made it here, we would go as units. But what actually in reality happened, when we started charging across here, and besides the boat being scattered all over because of the current and everything was happening, we weren't together really as units. And so with the enemy firing at us, there's only one thing you could do. You had to charge into the enemy and hope you'd make it and you could dislodge them. That was our first objective, and hope that we could do it. And I, fortunately, as I came further up here, I was one of the first guys that made it up there. I had been hit in the boat, and I charged up. I ran low, as low as I could run, and everything, and raising up and firing and charging towards the dike. When I got there, a fellow by the name of Hirsch, Elroy Hirsch, Hirsch, Sergeant Hirsch, my platoon sergeant, was with me, and he'd been shot through the arm, and he was bleeding, and I had a first aid packet on my boot, on my parachute boot. And I took it off and unraveled it, and I put some stuff on it, and I wrapped up his arm. And while we were waiting to see who was going to make it. Now, in the meantime, what happened was, as these men crossed the river and charged into the dike, they were doing it in groups of 2s and 3s and 4s. And if there was a sergeant, say, that was over here and a couple of privates over there, they hooked up with him. Maybe they didn't know him, and he might have been from another squad, but that was immaterial. They joined up with him. And the same thing, a sergeant over here, or like with me, a lieutenant, or Lieutenant Rivers, or others who were platoon leaders, and we were leading these things. As we charged up, men followed us. So what we had was small groups, 3, 4, 5, And eventually a half a dozen made it over to that bridge. And so there wasn't any unit integrity at all and when we got here. And the leadership that was portrayed was the non-commissioned officers. And they were platoon leaders. Now, this is a good point. If it fits in this documentary, fine. But the Army is organized vertically from top to bottom, from the commander-in-chief all the way down the squads. At every level, except platoons and squads, they're all commanders. Battalion commanders, regimental commanders, division commanders, corps commanders, army commanders, commander-in-chief, the president, all commanders. But none of them lead men. They don't command men, but they're commanders. They issue orders. They're important. I'm saying they're not. But the leaders in the Army are the squads and platoons where the battles are fought, and that's where it was fought here. That's where the decisive action was made, right on this battlefield here. And it was by men, privates following sergeants and non-commissioned officers. And in a broader sense, the leaders, platoon and squad leaders, paid the ultimate price. They had the most casualties. They were the youngest people, the less rank. They did all the fighting. They did the killing, they did the dying. But history is not expressed through their eyes. What I'm trying to do is point out here is what happened with sergeants leading and privates following and charging in the face of enemy machine gun fire, unrelenting, swearing and cussing, and dropping by the wayside when they were hit, but charging forward. Eventually, some of us made it here, and I was the first, as I indicated, and I was further up the line. On this side of me, towards the bridge, there was a group that came up, and there were three or four of them there, and they were from I Company, and there was a Sergeant White, and I'll never forget him, Sergeant White, and he got up there, and while I was on this side of the embankment, where we were protected from Germans wherever they were at, and I was on this side, he jumped up on top of this dike, and he looked out and he said, "There go those SOBs." He said, "Men after them." And he charged over, and as he charged over, the guys that knew him or were with him charged over. I said to Sergeant Hirsch, I said, "What in the hell are we doing here?" You know, the plan was we'd reorganize. Hell, we better get going. Now, where did I head for? Over in here, we'd taken a lot of heavy fire and heavy stuff, and they were the people that sunk one of my boats. Well, the enemy were there. That wasn't our main objective, but we had to neutralize it in order to accomplish it. So I head for there, and I turn around, there's 3 or 4 guys with me, following me, and we head for that direction. Others go for the bridge, others go here. And as they came in groups, they headed out, overcoming opposition everywhere along the line, wherever they met them, routing the Germans, cussing, swearing, fighting, everything else, every man, like they say, just obsessed with the enemy. And so we charged over, and we went down there, and there was an old medieval fort. We didn't really know about it. We hadn't been briefed about it, and nobody was really very much aware of it. It was a medieval fort, and we headed for there, and all as I saw was a bull, like a old medieval fort, if you can picture that. And the entrance was around behind, which we didn't know, was around behind. And there was a moat and a drawbridge and a moat around the water. And the Germans were in there, and they had these weapons that they were firing from outside this fort. One of my men that was with me, Sergeant Leroy Richmond, was with me. He was in my squad. He hooked up with me me and Hirsch. And when we got over there, and the Germans were still firing at us, and we got there and started firing back and throwing grenades at them, they left the top of that and went down below where they had bunkers. He took off his jacket and his gear, and he jumped in the water and he swam that moat. He swam that, and he went up, started climbing up that fort. And when he got up near the top, he looked down in there, and he began to wave at us, and all of a sudden, a German Mauser rifle rings out, and somebody up there shot him and creased his neck. And he fell backwards. But what he was telling us was, look, you got to go around the back end of it to get into this place. And he came down, he was okay. He was wounded, but he was nicked. He was fortunate. He had a rabbit's foot with him or something. So we went around the back end, and there we engaged the enemy, and I set up a machine gun and so on. In the meantime, guys were scattering. They were going everywhere. They were heading for the bridges. They were heading everywhere. And it was pandemonium, but it was small unit actions, people seizing an opportunity, led by guys who were leaders, whose job was to lead a squad and lead the men, who had the confidence of the men, and the men then followed them. And that was the story that unfolded here. And I use this as an example and even portray some of this background to make speeches. And interestingly enough, I have talked about this Wall River crossing to our troops in Afghanistan no less than a half a dozen times because the commanders asked me to do it. And I tell them about leadership. Hey, you sergeants, you're the squad leader. You're the guy, you're the guy. But the thing was, it also points out the ingenuity of non-commissioned officers and officers. They didn't wait here for further orders. If it had been the British, they would have reassembled and waited for their orders. That was their style. But we were paratroopers. We were hell-bound for election. We knew where the enemy was. We could see the objectives. We knew who was firing at us. So let's go get them, guys. We didn't need any further orders. Our commanders were on the other side of the river anyway. We started to cross at 3 o'clock, and by 7 o'clock at night, we controlled both bridges. We fought through all this opposition, and we paid a very, very heavy price. It was, and I can't overemphasize it, an epic battle, unequaled for daring and courage. What we were asked to do was suicidal, and we knew it. But we achieved our objective in any case. This is an epic case and should be understood, because what drives men in combat and the leadership involved is all here in this story. For 60 years, I didn't come back here, nor did I go back to any other place where I fought, in Germany, in Belgium, here, Italy, anywhere else. And the reason was that I had no desire, for example, to come here and cross this Wall River again and then relive that moment. And the memory I had, and particularly seeing one of my boats go down with half of my men groping in the water and drowning. I said I had no desire to do that, to come back here or anywhere else. Coming back here now, some 60 years later, and reliving an experience that I went through, a traumatic experience that left a big impact on me, it redefines me as who I am. This is one chapter, brief chapter, in a broader account of determining who Jim Magellan was. But all the way fighting into Berlin and what I saw, and the tragedy of war and the concentration camps and so on, has had an impact on me, as I said, and defines who I am and what I believe in. And in some ways, it molded my character in life. I think other veterans have gone through the same thing. Will tell you that what they went through was a defining moment in their life and shaped their life in many ways. They didn't have to live with it. This isn't something that I was aware of, but it was a defining moment. So when I come back, it's again that thought. Here I was, young guy, just out of college, volunteered for paratroopers, fighting in a brutal war, in the scene of a bloody battle. And that's the effect it has on me. Other than that, to be here and have any emotional feeling about it or anything, yeah, it's a tragedy and I relive it, but it doesn't have an effect on me that way. When you come here and you see people that are grateful like the Dutch are, and like these kids that are devoted to the battles that fought here, and study it and feel about it, then you realize that our efforts and what we were doing and the sacrifice we made were worthwhile, because here are future generations that now live in peace, can go to school of their choice, have freedom to move, they have freedom to go on to school, they have all the freedoms that they didn't have when we got here. Now, admittedly, it was for the Dutch people, but the same principle in a sense applies to us, that the monstrosity that the Nazis had created in Holland and in Belgium and the lowlands and France and all throughout Europe, if left unchecked, would have engulfed all freedom-loving people all over the world. So when I see these kids in the school enjoying freedom and the blessings of liberty and all the rest that we fought for, I realize that also applies to our generations and our kids. They live in a world that's free, and they're able to do the things that they want. And so while we made these sacrifices, and a lot of the guys didn't return, that we did something that's worthwhile. And when you see it in the faces of children and everything, then you know that your effort was. We're standing on the outskirts of the village of Harrisbach, Belgium, which was the objective of the 82nd Airborne Division when we left Remochamps, some 10 miles away, to proceed to capture this town. We were told it was an important center for the Germans, for a communication center and others, but it wasn't on the main line of resistance, but it was in our path as we were proceeding towards the Siegfried Line. And the original plan was that we would attack and capture this town and then proceed on from here to the Siegfried Line. That's the way we'd understood it in the rifle companies in my battalion. And we made a forced march to get here through deep snow. And you have to, everything is green now. And as you see it, if it's portrayed this way, you have to realize that this area was covered with heavy snow, maybe 2 feet of snow. And that for us to get here from 10 miles away, we had no land features or terrain features really to follow. As you have a road map, you can follow roads or you can follow other terrain features. And we went this 10 miles and we fought through a heavy wooded area. And much of the time I was leading the point, or my company was, and I was up in front, helping break trail and lead the point. And I was also trying to set the direction of which we were going. And all that we knew was the direction according to the azimuth from where we started out to here. We had the azimuth. And as we made progress every mile or so, I would take out my compass and I would set that azimuth, and I would set points ahead that we could follow. And I really mention that to you because in World War II we didn't have all of the gadgets and devices that we now have, GPSs, and to mention a few. And so we went by a compass, and I was leading, and I would pick, say, in the azimuth we were following, a very high point, a very high tree. And then we would proceed in that direction. And when I got there, I'd take another azimuth. Eventually, we approached where we had planned to be back here on the other side of this wooded area, this narrow wooded area, where we would spend the night and then attack in the morning. And the interesting thing about it is that when we left Remochamps in the morning on this forced march, we were told leave your bedrolls behind. When I talk about a bedroll, it was a single blanket rolled in the canvas shelter half, and we put over our back, and maybe a little pack under it with some other personal things. And we said, they were told, leave that behind, because when we get where we're going, we'll bring your bedrolls up. So we approached and got to the woods to hold up, and we didn't have any bedrolls, and they hadn't come up, at least not yet. And so we held up there, and it was dark, it was dusk, and so we pushed off, found a little area for our platoons and our companies where we would spend the night. And the men took out of their pocket a K-ration. And the K-ration was a little ration, kind of a little square box. It was made, intended for paratroopers because it fit in our jump pockets, and we could stuff several in and carry our rations for a day right in our pockets. It contained a little can of some kind of meat, pressed ham or something or other, that generally if we had an opportunity we'd heat or so on. But in this case, when we stopped and got out our K-rations, they were frozen. And the weather was below zero and it was freezing. And so they were frozen, so the men got them out and opened up, and they were eating this frozen food. In the meantime, the Germans proceeded out of this town and came down this road behind us, and there was a lead element of a Jeep, an American Jeep, and the driver had an American uniform on, but they were Germans. And they proceeded down this road and came into our general area, and we spotted them, and in the area where it came in was over to the left of me, and Rivers saw them and several others, and they opened fire on them. They killed the driver. They realized they were Germans. And from one of them, they got the story that there was a large element of German troops coming down this road in our direction. They were armed. They were coming in our direction. Well, when we got that word, obviously, we had to take action. We had to do something. We just couldn't sit there. And so the call came out, and it was dusk. The call came out from the regimental commander who had followed us because there were 2 battalions in the attack, but he had followed us. And he called for me, and he called for my buddy Rivers, and he called us back to where he was a little bit behind us. And he says, take your men, he says, and get into that damn town. Get that town, which was a 2 battalion objective. And he was talking to me. I was a platoon leader. I think I had 26 men that were still alive, 26 men, and Rivers maybe the same. And the original plan was we'd take it with 2 battalions, which would have been, I would guess we were under strength in most of the companies, having suffered casualties, but it would have been 400 or 500 men that would attack this town from 2 directions. Given the fact that we figured that intelligence figured there was a battalion here, so in the attack, 2 to 1, well, okay, you can manage that. Instead, we end up with 55 of us coming up this road in snow with 2 tank destroyers with us, and while the Germans are coming from this direction towards us. That's the way the battle began to shape up. A lot of us realized that what was happening, got in behind the tanks for cover from the direction in which the enemy were coming, and others got up on top of the tanks, and so on as we proceeded in. And we got in a little ways, and we noticed these columns of Germans coming out. We dismounted, and we headed in towards them to take them on. And shortly thereafter, we were in the middle of them. And all hell broke loose. I carrying a Thompson submachine gun. Everybody had a weapon. We didn't have any automatic weapons. They were personal weapons, small arms. And we began to open fire on them. And I remember that time I had a pouch here hanging on my side with clips for my Thompson submachine gun. And I had taken the clips that held 30 rounds and I welded them together, kind of like in this fashion, so that I could feed in this version, and then turn it around when it was empty and put in the other half instead of digging, looking around for another. That's something we did. It didn't come that way, but we did. And I had a pouch full of those. And I flipped one in my Tommy gun, and I started opening fire. And the guys were all around us, and there was a narrow road here. And the minute we opened fire, it was pandemonium. I mean, everybody was shooting. Our guys were all firing. The enemy was everywhere, all around us. There were targets everywhere. They tried to run in the woods. They tried this and that and the other. And after about 10 or 15 minutes firing, it quieted down. We killed a lot of them. A lot of them ran in the woods and escaped and so on. Actually, the ground was littered with blood and dead, and it was all Germans. Wasn't an American hit. None of us were hit at all. It was the most amazing thing. And so we proceeded to come up this road, and when we got near here, a tank came or must have come around this road. They were all dirt roads then, they weren't blacktop. Must have come around here and set up and began to fire at us. And I was in the lead element of my platoon, and we were coming down the road, and the minute they fired on us, we took cover. Hit the ground, took cover, got off the road, and so on, and they began to fire at us. So it was a critical moment in the attack on this. It was a critical moment in the attack of this town. And obviously, you know, we had to dispose of the tank, or we weren't going to come in. We were going to hold us up at least. Or under worse conditions, we'd have suffered a lot of casualties, but we'd have gotten here in any case. And instinctively, as the platoon leader, I charged for it. And what I did was I ran off the side of the road and got in that wooded area. So I had concealment heading for the tank. And men back were taking cover, and one of them writes, one of the squad leaders writes in the book, he says, when we saw Maggie take off and that tank was firing us, he says, I had my men firing on that tank to give him cover, some cover. And I proceeded then, and the tank was down a ways, a good ways, just around the corner. And I proceeded over there and got there close enough so that I could take what I call a gammon grenade out of my pocket. And the gammon grenade was a composition C plastic, a plastic explosive that you could mold. And I had it molded into a ball, and I had a cover over it with a firing device. I took the gammon grenade out and activated it and got close enough and threw it like you would throw a baseball. And I threw it over in the broad side of the tank. It hit the side of it. And while the tank was active and could move, I had the effect of knocking out its tracking device. And maybe did much more than that. I'm really not certain. But in any event, the gunner who was up there went down into the tank. There was a turret there. And the machine gun, he went down into the tank. And I then charged up the tank and came up and got up there close enough and got up there and where I could get there. And I dropped a hand grenade down that tank. Well, I don't know how many were in a tank, but it could have been a crew of 5. I didn't bother to look, I wasn't concerned. But I threw a hand grenade in there and then things were all quiet. So I get up and I motion, let's go. The guys come in. We work our way in here and we pretty well eliminated the opposition. A lot of them had taken off and going into town. Others headed up there for the hills and so on. I proceeded down this road and got to the end of the town and set up security while Rivers and his men and then the others came up behind him, went into town. And eventually we rounded up over 200 prisoners in that town. And by my count, which I had put in writing, and eventually early thereafter, we killed 180 Germans in taking this town. And we didn't lose a man, except when the Germans later counterattacked. I suffered some casualties, the men that I put on. This is the final resting place. These guys didn't make it. This has a special story for me, this great. Harold Busby and I were in parachute school together in Fort Benning. We sailed over to Africa together. We have joined the 82nd together, and we were in the 504th Parachute Regiment together. We fought all through Italy and through the mountains of Italy. We fought through Anzio. We were close buddies. When we were assembled back at the dike in Holland, remember what I said? We were waiting for the boats. We didn't know what was up. And I told you everybody was making their farewells and their peace and so on. We gathered in small groups and huddled together and discussed it. But realistically speaking, I didn't think anybody'd make it across there alive. I didn't think so. I wonder even today. Anyway, Pappy Busby was in I Company. I was the other company besides H. He was an officer. He was a platoon leader. And while Rivers and I were congregated and saying, you know, if we make it, don't see our mothers, and Pappy Busby comes over from, they were down the dike a little further from us. And he came up to me and he came up and he looked at me and he says, Maggie, he says, I don't think I want to make it today. But I looked at him and I said, oh, come on now, Pappy. I said, you know, every time we went into a combat mission, whether it was in the mountains of Italy, it was at Anzio or wherever, we had casualties. It was a war. We expected it. But I said, Pappy, it doesn't mean you're going to get it. That's ridiculous. You'll be okay. You'll be okay. I looked at him now. I'm telling you this. I looked at him and I forgot. He was shaking. His face was discolored. And nothing I could say to him could dissuade him from the fact that he wasn't going to make it. This fellow here, buddy of mine. Anyway, he went back to I Company. He was in another boat for me. And we get in our boats that we come across. And he made it across the river. But when he got to the other side, machine gun cut him down. I never saw him again, ever. He was a buddy. And the war continued and went on, and we went on to Berlin, and I never saw him again till I came here to this cemetery. And I stood here. 60-some years later. It's a remembrance of a buddy, like you go to the cemetery and your family and your But for us, this place has a special meaning because they didn't make it back and they paid the ultimate price, and they were our buddies. We'll never forget them, and we don't want Americans ever to forget our servicemen and what they've done. So it has special meaning. And what I said, I mean, just tell you that John, I remember him, he's a good-looking young guy. He had a good smile. He's a friendly fellow and all that. I always remember him that way. And but here we rest. And one final thing I want to say is that we knew it was danger, but there's a certain dignity associated with it. And John was one of them. And failed at Arnhem. The 82nd Airborne Division was deployed along a line here because this is the boundary between Holland and Germany. And the Germans had forces on their side, and we pulled back from Nijmegen, and we were deployed here. The battalion I was at was behind me up in high ground. And we could look out over the high ground, over the Weiler Mirror, and this is part of it, this estuary, and we could look out here, and this is where the Germans were at. And they were here. It was a separation between the two countries. And it was a defensive position, and all that we were doing was trading artillery, bombardments, running patrols, and so on. And then I got a call at regiment one night from the regimental commander come up to the regiment, wanted me to take out a patrol and come over into Germany here and secure prisoners. And that was the scenario. So I went back and got my platoon together, got them up, got them organized, stood up in the high ground and looked out over this flat area down below us, and then pointed out where we thought we would find the enemy dug in. And the reason we felt we'd find them is because there was a kind of a dike that ran out here at that time, and there was, and at certain points there was a lot of fresh dirt, which indicated they were digging foxholes. So we assumed that that's where we would find the Germans if we were going to get our prisoners. So we come down from the high ground. We tried to cross the Weiler Mirror, but it's a big body of water, like a lake in some places, and it was not fordable. We couldn't get across it to get into Germany. So we continued following along the Weiler Mirror till I found a narrowing and with a footbridge. And of course we could get there, and that led into the area we wanted to go looking for our German prisoners. And I was leading the patrol. I took my whole platoon. The medic, I took everybody. We expected to get in a heavy firefight, and casualties and all the rest. And so we started out. And eventually we approached the footbridge as a way to get into the German area. And that's where the action started. At that time in 1944, when I led this patrol, I was 27 years old. I was an old man. And most of the men in my patrol were teenagers or young guys, 20 or 21. So I was older and I was more experienced. And not only that, but I had survived a lot of combat and fought all through Italy and all through Anzio. And so that I was more skilled in leading a patrol than sending, say, a private or someone else, which I could have been as the platoon leader. So it was a case of you had a mission to accomplish. You're responsible, as I had, I think that time, 26 men with me. You're responsible for their well-being, and you've got a mission to accomplish. You're going to use the best guy that you've got to lead that patrol, and that happened to be me. I'd be the patrol leader, one and the same. And that was the case in all the patrols I led. I was always the most experienced guy. If we were running into an enemy situation, I knew what to expect. If I'm running into a minefield, I knew how to disarm a mine. I knew how to do all these things. Whereas a lot of my guys were great soldiers, but they didn't have that same skill. So I always used the term that I was a platoon leader and I led from the front. I wasn't a commander who commands from the rear. And I think that's true. That statement's true. I used it not just for myself, but most of my buddies, Lieutenant Rivers and Blankenship and all the rest lieutenants, they all did the same thing. And you know, and let me just speculate here. When I tell this story and then I write it, a guy said, yeah, but if you're leading a patrol and you're the first guy out there, aren't you taking a lot of risk? Won't you suffer a lot of casualties? I said, yes, that's true. I said, the point guy is the first guy who's going to get shot at. He's the first guy that comes in sight. But by the same token, if you're the platoon leader and you gain the respect of your men and they follow you, they'll support you in everything you do, and your chances of surviving the war are a hell of a lot greater than the guy who stood in the back telling them what to do. In either way. And I always assumed that that was my best chance. And since I was, in most cases, 7, 8, 9 years older than the rest of them, that was it. So I'd lead the patrol. And so we approached a situation that didn't look just right to me. And mind you now, these are night patrols. It's dark, it's quiet. Envision being out here at night, and you look up and you don't see any stars, you don't see anything. No sound, no noise, but off in the distance you'll see muzzle flashes, artillery shells firing. They're firing into us, and they're off in the distance, and you see them. And you know out in here there is the enemy. You can't see any land features. You can't give oral orders. You can't use lights. You can't do anything. You go by the seat of your pants, by what I call dead reckoning. And I had a certain instinct for direction. And once I had fixed in my mind where I was going to go to get into the German area, it was like a map in a computer. I don't know if you can appreciate this or not. The average guy, I think, would even question my saying this. But that was a fact. I had a sense, like I say about a deer. A deer has a sense of direction. When he's in danger, he acts a certain way. I think the Lord gave us some of those instincts. I felt I had a lot of instincts, and one of them was that I could lead a patrol at night and have an idea where I was going. And I wouldn't get disoriented and lost and so on. And so I felt I had that quality. And the fact that I'm here today, after 2.5 years of combat, attests the fact that I did have some of that quality, or I wouldn't be here. And so I would lead and start out, and I would lead. And as we approached a place that didn't look right to me, where the enemy might be dug in or have an outpost, I knew pretty well how they organized. You know, we've been fighting them all through Italy and everywhere else, and I knew pretty well how the Germans operated. We had approached something that looked dangerous. I wouldn't just bring my men up to that point and have the enemy open up with machine gun fire on us. I'm very careful. Normally, in a larger unit, they would send a squad or platoon forward. I'd go myself when I was leading patrol. These were my guys. It was my family, so to speak. It's a hard thing to explain. I think a military man who's been in combat will understand that. These are my guys. Their lives are important to me, so I'd risk my own. So, all right, so okay. So anyway, I started out, and when I approached something that don't look right, as I did in this case, as one on the Weiler Mere, I halted my patrol and had them down on the ground, face down, so they wouldn't form a silhouette, even at night, to draw fire. And I would go forward alone to investigate what I saw. And in this case, it was the narrowing of the Weiler Mere with a footbridge. And I assumed that that was a way that we could get in there and get behind into the enemy lines. And it was a way. But I also assumed, and knowing the Germans, that they would have protected. They would have an outpost that would have a number of people there because it was an entry into their main line of resistance. And so I went forward alone. And as I got closer to it, within about 50 feet from here, maybe 100 feet, from here to 100 feet away, I then hit the ground and I began to crawl towards that bridge with my arms outstretched and my fingers going in the scissor-like action. And what I was looking for was tripwires. Now the Germans what they would do is, if they protected a bridge or they protected an installation, they would mine it. That gave them great protection. And they dig in these mines and they'd run in tripwires so that they're just off the ground. And if you step on that tripwire, up bounces this mine, and if it was an S mine, it splatters pellets all over. And the killing range is, everybody around is going to get killed. And I assumed that they had this mine, and I assumed that they had S mines. I'd run into S mines in Italy. The first man I had killed in my platoon was killed by an S mine. So I had great respect for that, and I also made it my point to know how to disarm one. If we did find one, it wasn't easy to do, but I knew how to do it. And I think I was the only one in my platoon. So why did I send some of my young guys out there to do something that they would get killed doing? So anyway, as I approached it and I got within 75 feet or 100 feet, I then went on my stomach and with my finger-light action started crawling. And I crawled up to that bridge. I didn't find any tripwires, much to my surprise. But on across this footbridge, they had a coil of what we call accordion wire. It comes in a bale, and then you pull it out and you stretch it out, and it's barbed, and they call it accordion wire. And so they had accordion wire strung across there, which impedes your ability to cross that bridge, but they didn't have it in mind. So once I got there and didn't find any mines, then I wanted to make sure that they weren't dug in on the other side before I brought my patrol up, which I still had back here on the ground. I got hung up on that barbed wire. I caught my pants in there. And I got so damn mad. God damn it, I swore, I was really teed off. I ripped my pants and everything. And when I uttered a sound, I could see out ahead of me, maybe 20, maybe 40 feet ahead, a couple of German helmets popped up out of a hole. I said, here's where they are. They're here. This is where their outpost is. I quickly got myself extracted from the barbed wire, hit the ground again and started crawling towards those helmets. And I reasoned that since this was a point of entry into their main line of resistance, that they probably had a squad, maybe 10 men, probably reasoned quickly, that they probably had a machine gun there and all that. And this is what I was faced with by myself. So I crawled over there, and I crawled over the edge of where I'd seen that helmet pop out of the hole, and I hollered down in German, "Kommen Sie mit der Handhack. Kommen Sie her!" And I got no response in German. I knew a little German. I mean, I knew what I needed to know in combat. And you come out with your hands up. And I heard nothing. But I knew that I'd seen the helmet there, so I took one of my hand grenades, pulled the pin, and I rolled it in on them. And then I crawled over to the next hole and repeated it. I says, "Kommen Sie her. Kommen Sie her mit der Handhack." Nothing. So I rolled in another one. Again, a sound, but then the sound of two grenades going off woke up this patrol. I don't know what was happening to them. I mean, don't ask me. In combat, men do strange things, react differently. They're human beings. They don't follow any set pattern. It's an unnatural situation where your life's on the line. It's mortal combat. You can't describe it. You can't write it. You can't explain it. People, you could never understand it unless you experienced it. And when I did that, and then I had then I saw other people. And I go over to another hole, and I holler again, come out, and he didn't do it. And this time, instead of a hand grenade, I went on the edge of that foxhole with my Thompson submachine gun, opened fire on him. So that was the third one I'd got. And then with that, up jumps one guy, he's got his hands up in the air, a German soldier. Now I'm all alone, I don't know how many there are there. I know there's an outpost there. Now, how many there are, I don't know. And as I say, at that point I was running on instinct and adrenaline and so on. In the dark of night, in strange land, in an unknown situation and so on. And you're in with a bunch of men and it's you or them, and I was all alone. And so I put my armor on him like this. I dug my submachine gun in his back, and I said to him in German, "Wie viel Deutsch Soldat hier?" And he said to me, "Nix verstehe." Well, I knew he had to understand me. My German wasn't that bad, and I'd used this before with Germans, and they always seemed to respond. I said, "Nix verstehe." He says, "Nix verstehe, nix verstehe." So I tugged him a little tighter and choked him a little more and tugged him back. And I asked him again, "How many German soldiers here in German?" And he said, "I don't understand." With that, I lost my patience with this guy. He was a prisoner, and that's what we were after. But he wasn't going to make it back to prison camp alive if he didn't tell me what I needed to know. I was involved in mortar combat with I didn't know how many German soldiers, right? So I get him by the neck and I wrestle him down to the ground, and I get him down there, and then I put my two hands on his throat and lay him on the ground and I say, "Wie viel Deutsch Soldat hier?" He tells me again, "Nix verstehe." I had about had it with this guy. I had a knife, I was about ready to cut his throat, but instead, I took my Thompson submachine gun and I whacked him across the face with the butt of my gun. I must have broken his jaw and his teeth and everything else. I then stand him up again with my Thompson submachine gun back in his back, and I said to him in English, "Call out for your buddies to come out and surrender." And he started out. I remember Fritz or Hans, you call them by their first name. And but nobody did jump up. But he was calling them. And I noticed off to the left, with a better angle on the footbridge, the cover looked to me like there was a big hole and it might have been an automatic weapon. So I crawled over there, and there was a machine gun. And I hollered at them to come out, and they didn't. So I rolled in a couple of hand grenades on them. At that point, I felt confident that the threat was pretty much under control, but not over. So then I called back to the sergeant, says, "Bring the patrol up." So they did. And they came out, and they fanned out across this whole area. And before we were through, that German prisoner was correct. There were 10 Germans there. He was one of them. He was one of 4 that were captured, and we killed the other 6. And at that point, we'd actually accomplished a mission. I had prisoners, but we hadn't accomplished our objective, and that was to attack the main line. So I took 2 men out of my squad, 2 of the new men, out of my patrol. And I said, "I want you to take these 4 German prisoners and take them back the way we came, retrace our footsteps, and go to I Company. And there, they'll take the prisoners from you and get them up to regiment." So they left. Then the remainder of my platoon and I fanned out and started out towards the main line. And it was a dug-up area, and there were some featured landmarks and so on. And we approached that very carefully. When we got there, we kind of fanned out into 3 squads, and then we charged over the top and got in behind there where the Germans dug in. And we got in a firefight with them. We killed a number in their hole. We took 2 more prisoners. But one of my sergeants, one of my squad leaders, was shot. One of the Germans stood up and shot him, probably with a machine pistol. And this sergeant's name was Fowler. The German bullet went through his forearm, the butt of his Thompson submachine gun and in his stomach and lodged near his back. And he fell, obviously, badly wounded. And somebody in his squad, he was a squad leader, his name was Fowler, hollered, "Medic, medic, medic." And I always said that the most dreaded words that a combat platoon leader can hear in a situation like that is a call for medic, because you know somebody's been hit. It's a chilling sound, but they call for the medic. And the medic, his name was Richard Van Ort. He's from Chicago area. And he rushed over there and determined that indeed he had been hit. And he called for me and he says, "Lieutenant," he says, "Fowler's been hit pretty bad." And so I went running over there and he said to me, "If we don't get him back," he said, "he ain't gonna make it." Well, again, put yourself in my position. He's one of my squad leaders. Means more to me than just about anything. And he's laying there behind enemy lines. And if you don't get to our lines, he's going to die. Well, you do what a leader does. You take action. And you don't have to think about it. You don't have to open the book and read and see what the infantry manual says. You just know. You just know. Because that's why you're in that position. So I picked him up and I threw him over my shoulder like a fireman carry. Threw him over this shoulder. And this one, I had the Thompson submachine gun. I had him draped over me. And then I gave the call, "Let's pull back." And the other squads disengaged, came back down. And one of them had 2 more prisoners. And I hollered to them, "Bring those guys over here to me." And they did. The sergeant brought them over. And I put these 2 guys in front of me. I trained my submachine gun on them, and I said to them in German, "Mach schnell, get going, hurry, let's get going." The reason I did that was I assumed that going back we might run into more German opposition, but if they were under the point of my gun, they would avoid that. As we started out, began to pull the way back, the Germans began to then shoot up mortars. And the mortars would come down, or flares. And they'd shoot up flares, and flares would light up and then light the battlefield. So every time a flare would go up, you could see it going up. It's kind of a burning tail or something. And I knew that was a flare. So we'd hit the dirt. And here I am hitting the dirt with Sergeant Fowler draped over my shoulder. 2 German prisoners, and I was telling them to get down. I didn't want them revealing their position either, and the Tommy gun trained on their back. Anyway, that was the way it was. But we finally made it back, and when I got to this Weiler Mirror and that footbridge, I knew we were home safe. I knew where we were. But all that time was by instinct. Carrying a guy that was dying, 2 German prisoners, leading a patrol back, enemy firing mortars at you. Anyway, we get back, send the prisoners back. We go back to our position, spend the night there. Tomorrow would be another day in the war, and the war would continue. And I never thought about it. It was a day's work. Later on, I was told that I was being put in for a medal. And I said, "Well, that's okay, but you don't do it for medals. You do it because it's your job. And you're told to do it, and you do it, and you do as well as you can. And it's a war. I mean, you know, you're not out trying to earn any distinction for yourself. It's you or the enemy. He kills you or you kill him. If you prevail and you've done something great, somebody thinks somebody want to give you a medal, okay, so be it. But if they don't, it's okay too." And I don't say that cavalierly. I say that realistically. As I was later on told I was going to get the Medal of Honor. And I never thought anything about that either. Because those are things that don't enter your mind. But later, and it happened in Berlin, Germany, the Distinguished Service Cross, the 2nd highest medal for gallantry, was approved in Washington, and I was awarded it in Berlin 6 months later, about the time frame it took to get it. But that is what took place here. This was the scene. This was part of the operation of Market Garden, is where we took up defensive positions and spent altogether 58 days here in Holland, either defending what we had already taken from the Germans or attacking them or they us. Until